this episode of The Exchange, I speak to Alex Holmes about the benefits of writing and speaking when you're struggling with mental health. And Pooky Knightsmith talks about how we can look after ourselves and others during this pandemic. Pooky, it is so great to have you on this episode of The Exchange today to talk about mental health. What a year it has been. I mean, mental health has been such a constant battle for many of us during this pandemic. Why do you think it's so important that we're tuning into how we're feeling right now?
I think it's been an interesting time for everyone, hasn't it? And some of us have had a good experience, some of us have had a bad experience, but we've all experienced something really different than what we might have expected to this year. One of the things that for me feels really important right now is to make sure that everyone just kind of takes stock a little bit of how they're feeling, because those people who might not have ever had any kind of wobbles with their mental health before are perhaps a little bit more vulnerable now than maybe their peers who have dealt with kind of anxiety or depression in the past. So I think it's, mental health is everyone's business right now, and everyone's having their ups and downs.
And obviously mental health is on a spectrum, and so is mental illness. How do we know if we're suffering from anxiety or depression as opposed to feeling a bit worried or low?
I think one thing just to kind of recognise right now really is that as we are in the middle of this pandemic, that we are seeing an uptick in anxiety and depression, and lots of people might be experiencing some of those symptoms for the first time, where they might be feeling very worried or a bit anxious, and their mood might be lower. They might be finding things a bit more difficult. Their thoughts might be more negative than usual, and that's quite normal. That's a really normal response to the situation right now. So if we're finding that our head is often full with very difficult thoughts or very, very negative thoughts and feelings, and particularly if we've got kind of feelings of hopelessness or really challenging thoughts about the future that are really impacting on us disproportionately more than it seems to be impacting our friends, then I would begin to think this is something that really needs a bit of extra help and support.
Alex, it's so great to have you on this episode of The Exchange. Can you just tell me a little bit about how you got into your work as a mental health podcaster and writer?
So I started out my career working as a journalist on a pretty busy tabloid newspaper, and eventually I ended up working in lifestyle writing, and I began to have conversations with really interesting people about well-being and about their different habits and how they kind of get through life and through different elements of working through anxiety, working through depression, working through all of those different topics. And so while working in this really busy paper and in this really busy environment, I myself had several breakdowns and several panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And because I had this high functioning anxiety, it means that it's just, it's like a perceived busyness. It's a perceived, oh, everything is fine, everything's okay. But there's a real undercurrent of just nerves and worry that happened. And then I just began writing about it. Writing had always been my form of creative expression. And I thought, actually, it would be interesting to start a podcast where I'm having these conversations with people about their health and their well-being.
Your podcast is called Time to Talk, and the last few months have been incredibly challenging for so many people. Why do you think it is so important to talk about mental health?
It's important to talk about mental health because it is an element of our health that we just have for such a long time ignored. If you have a tough job, or if you're going through a breakup, or if you've lost somebody, it's your minds that will really impact the way that your emotional response to these things. So I think it's time to talk about so many different elements of mental health that there's always going to be a conversation about it going on. I think we're reaching a point where only so much can be done and continued in the way that we're continuing it now, because we are being stretched, we're being pushed, we're being pulled, and there's a lot of pressure everywhere, and a lot of things aren't making sense. The last few months have been very difficult. I think I started the year, as anybody does, with reckless abandon and super confidence in the positivities and the optimism of the year, only for March to come and tell me that that wasn't the case. And I was okay. I was okay. I was quite disciplined with what I was doing. I was in the gym. I was focused. I was getting up early. I was doing all these things until it got to around June, when lockdown was really in force, and I had kind of like not seen any of my friends in a long time. It became very difficult. Podcasting has really helped me because it means that I have the daily conversation. I mean, I've been recording every day pretty much since August. I've learned that I'm not alone in any of this. Everybody is going through their own kind of rubbish, you know, everybody's going through their stuff. There's always somebody to talk to. There's always somebody who will get it.
So many things can cause these anxious thoughts. I wonder if you could give us some really simple strategies for how to manage anxiety.
Yeah, so the first thing I always say to people is that if you name it, then you've got some chance of taming it. So actually just stopping and naming what those worries are in your head. And when we stop and we kind of list out our worries, quite often we'll find that there are some things there which we can do something else about ourselves. There'll be some things that we can get someone to help us with. And there'll be some things there that when we actually take time to write them down or talk to someone about them, we find that they're not really worries. Then there are other things that we can do in terms of just trying to help ourselves to feel a bit calmer. So things like practicing mindfulness, or learning different breathing strategies or grounding techniques. And there's loads of these things out there. You can Google them. And these are just things that will help you just to feel a little bit more calm in the current moment.
And when we're doing these breathing exercises, what's actually happening? Why is this so important? Because I know often people say, just breathe, just take time to breathe. But why?
Why? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So when we're anxious, when we're worried, then our body kind of responds in a really clever way. Our physiology means that our kind of heart beats faster and our breathing quickens. We're basically getting ready to go into battle mode. But the problem is that if that happens when you're in the middle of an English lesson, then you're just left feeling really quite uncomfortable. But you're left with the faster heart, and maybe your palms are sweating and your breath is going fast. And our breathing is something that we can actually take control of. So we take control back over the anxiety rather than it controlling us. So when we use something like a breathing strategy, what we're looking to do is just to really lengthen and deepen those breaths in. And what that does is it tells our brain and our body, it's okay, I'm in control here, I'm calm, and it begins to reverse that physiological response.
Struggling with depression can make you feel really lethargic and tired. And trying to get help when you're feeling like this sometimes just feels impossible. Do you have any advice for people who are suffering?
When we're really down, just getting out of bed in the morning can feel like a massive battle. So it's really, really hard. I mean, the number one piece of advice I would give is just don't go it alone. And actually reaching out to a friend, reaching out to an adult that you can trust will mean that you don't have to fight these battles on your own. The other thing that I find helpful with this is just thinking really carefully about routine. So lots of young people have been struggling over the period of lockdown because they fell out of routine. So school makes us get up and get out and spend time connecting with people. It gives us a sense of purpose and belonging, and a lot of people lost that for a really long time. So actually the routine of school is really, really helpful. But then we might think to ourselves, well, what does my routine look like in the holidays, or what would my routine look like if I wasn't going to school during a period of isolation, for example? And trying to stick with that routine, so you're doing the same things in the same way each day, makes it a little bit easier. So yeah, routine is your friend.
At the start of the conversation, you mentioned, I suppose, the battle that you've personally had with anxiety. What have been some of the most helpful things for you, aside from obviously being on this podcast and interviewing people?
Yeah, exercise, super helpful. I found that when I don't exercise, my body doesn't help with my mental state at all. Journaling, since 2011, I've bought a black moleskin notebook fill the pot, like, you know, for every year since 2011. And I just journal each day, sometimes weekly, depending on my schedule and how busy I am, making sure that I get all my thoughts down in there and that I can start to reflect and just kind of demist on the day. I think once we get grounded in our days, it becomes a lot easier, because with my anxiety, it's more like I'm thinking about what's happening 3 days from now rather than actually what's happening today.
I think with anxiety, sometimes it's sort of, we spend so much of our mental energy looking ahead into the future and sort of imagining how it's going to be. Do you think part of journaling is just sort of bringing yourself back into the present moment where you can control that particular thing?
Yeah, a lot of it is to do with control, to be honest, and bringing us back to center. If you sit down at 9 p.m. in the evening and journal about your day, you begin to start thinking about the things that happened. And a lot happens in a day, and we don't realize how much happens in a day. So I think that once we reflect on these things and we reflect on the positive stuff that's happened in the day, we can start to really kind of make room for a real, like, optimistic times, you know, especially in these times where we're getting a lot of negative news and quite scary information. Sometimes it's good to just be able to reflect on a day and try and reflect on the good bits. So yeah, I mean, but that's my form of creative expression, you know. People find it in music, people find it in movement, people find it in so many different things. So it's about literally finding that one piece of peace and just rolling with it.
If a friend is going through anxiety or depression, how can we best support them through that?
Listening is the most important thing that you can do. And as a friend, sometimes we worry that we might say the wrong thing, or we don't know how to fix this, or what should happen next. And actually, sometimes you don't need to know what to do. You don't have to have the right answers. You don't need to be able to fix this. Sometimes your friend just needs to feel heard and know that they're not going to be judged for the things that they're telling you. That said, you need to also understand, you know, what is an appropriate amount of stuff for you to be taking on as a friend, and when you should then be reaching out to an adult that you trust. And sometimes the really important role of the friend is to help to reach out to an adult who can help the both of you in this situation, and enable your friend to get the support. Sometimes being a good friend looks like doing exactly what your friend asks you not to do. So if you're particularly worried about your friend, perhaps they've confided in you that they are self-harming, or maybe they feel suicidal, really scary stuff to manage as a friend, and they might say, please don't tell anyone. But actually, in those instances, you know, we need really to open up to an adult who can then help us both, in order to keep both ourselves and our friends safe. Most of us will go through some of these periods, whether it's days or weeks or months. And when we start talking about it, we often realise that we're surrounded by other people who've experienced similar things. And it's just the silence that makes us feel that we're alone in it. So just starting talking about it's really, really important.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much for having me on.